a time when you regret it someday, when you grow lonely. Your heart will break like mine, and you want me only. After you've gone away. After you've gone, help me crying. After you've gone, there's no denying. You feel blue, you feel sad, you miss the best pal you ever had. Lord, there'll come a time, now don't forget it. There'll come a time when you regret it someday, when you grow lonely. Your heart will break like mine, and you want me only. After you've gone away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our first installment of the Authors and Artists series post our summer hiatus, and we're returning just in time for Halloween with an orange and black mystery for you. We have with us today Steve Riegel, who is going to be speaking to Bruce Peterson, our co-producer of the Authors and Artists series, about his book, Finding Judge Crater. And Steve really has two tales to tell today, which Bruce is going to tease out in a very interesting way. One about Judge Crater and the mystery, and the other about how he came to write this book, the experience, and how it came to be published. So Steve is a lawyer. Since graduating with a major in history from Princeton, he's been a federal and state court litigator in both New York and New Jersey for almost 40 years, specializing in appellate litigation. And he's really done it all. He's practiced with law firms, government agencies, and clerked for federal judges. He served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn for 11 years, so he knows about crime. His JD is from Stanford University Law School, and we are looking forward to hearing about this long journey. Bruce, as you may not know, is also a history major and is a lifelong history buff who spent 3 decades in New York during a career in finance with Goldman Sachs. And he continues to be a hobbyist historian, and in Park City is actually the trustee of a history museum and preservation effort. Our format today will be the same as it usually is. We'll listen to the conversation between Steve and Bruce for about an hour. We have the chat function and the QA function enabled, so please put your questions in the QA function, but we'll be able to see chat as well. And as always, we'll be recording the session, and you'll be able to view it on YouTube. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve and Bruce.
Thanks, Catherine.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, glad, and we certainly appreciate the participation of our numerous authors in this. I don't think we knew each other at all at Princeton, but there's a decent chance we sat in some of the same history lectures throughout, and I know we both studied we both researched the same era for our theses when both in and around and post World War I. Mine was more foreign policy focused, and yours was more domestic, as you mentioned. Did you entertain any thoughts of being a historian when you were in school?
I did. And I actually got a master's in history at Stanford in addition to the JD, and I was kind of undecided, and the law won out. But I've always had, a love of history, and researching and writing this book has been just fabulous experience for me.
Yeah, did you catch any of the bug to write history when you were working on your thesis, or was it kind of post that?
It's been recently that not so recently. I started this book about 25 years ago, but it's something I want to continue to do in the future in my retirement. And there was, speaking of my Princeton years, kind of strange connection with my book, the research for my book. My senior thesis advisor was then Professor Nancy Weiss, now Professor Emeritus Nancy Malkiel. And as Bruce said, my thesis involved it kind of post-World War I political economy. But when I started doing the research for the book, and especially on Tammany Hall, I was very surprised to come across the definitive biography on Tammany Hall boss Charles Francis Murphy. And so it turns out that I guess she had written her master's thesis, which was published, and it was very helpful. Charles Francis Murphy was the boss at Tammany Hall during most of Crater's time in New York City, and plays a big part in my book. So that was kind of like deja vu. But
very good. Why don't we? There's a lot to talk about. Why don't you just give our attendees a quick overview of who Judge Crater was and what happened, just very quickly.
Okay, in a nutshell, he was a sitting state court judge and rather prominent figure in Manhattan over the 1920s. He was also involved in politics. He was a womanizer. So high profile guy. He, on the night of August 6th, 1930, he leaves a restaurant on West 45th Street with a lawyer friend of his and a girlfriend of the lawyer friends. And they step out of the restaurant, and Crater hails a taxi that's going down 45th Street. Gets in it, and that's the last anybody's seen or heard from him. Despite a decades-long intensive manhunt, kind of led by the New York City Police Department, there were no confirmed sightings of him after he got into the taxi. His body has never been found. In fact, no one with possible personal knowledge of what may have happened to him afterwards surfaced until 25 years after his disappearance. The New York Police Department closed the case 50 years after it opened as unsolved. And so it's kind of like an immaculate mystery. It's one of the most confounding historical mysteries and true crime stories in American history, basically.
it was a huge deal at the time, right? I mean, just pictures of him all over the world and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. In the preview, there was a missing posters poster for Judge Crater, and that was literally distributed all around the country, all around the world. It was posted in public facilities, post offices, ship terminals, and it became kind of almost a cultural craze at the time. You know, he vanished under very mysterious circumstances. Once his disappearance became public, which was actually almost a month after he got into the taxi cab, there were all kinds of coverage in the tabloids of women who knew him, and it just became totally sensationalized. It got to the point where it was so publicized that it was in a Marx Brothers show, theatrical show, Animal Crackers. He's mentioned kind of jokingly. Comedians had a punchline: "Judge Crater, please call your office." Walter Winchell, who was a nationally syndicated radio host that was very popular, would predict every once in a while that Crater was going to reappear, which never. And so there was a whole ballyhoo about the disappearance, and it really kind of captivated the country in the 1930s.
Well, I told you when we were first meeting one another to prep for this that I first heard of it, and it's an incident that you actually mention in your book. It was, I first heard of it watching the Dick Van Dyke Show in 1963. And I vividly remember it because I didn't understand the joke. There was a judge that had a name similar to Crater that appeared in the show, and I didn't get the joke. And I asked my father, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's become a punchline that's probably funny to everyone except Judge Crater's family." So that's my sort of lowbrow familiarity with the case. What attracted you to the story, other than it's an obviously interesting mystery? What got you started with this?
Well, actually, the New York Times up to the early 1990s, on the anniversary of Crater's disappearance, would have an article relating to the disappearance. And I think I first must have read that. And I ended up going down to the New York Public Library on 42nd Street. This was like in the late 80s, and looked through the card catalog, saw that basically the only thing published was his wife's memoirs, which we could talk about later, but were not too helpful. And then I noticed in the card catalog a microfilm of collected articles that somebody had, maybe they were thinking of writing a book on it, had cut out articles from the time he disappeared to up through the 1960s, all having to do with the disappearance. And at that point, I kind of thought, well, somebody started my research, and it was a good way to get involved. But what really attracted to me to writing the book were two aspects of it. One was the history of New York City in the 1920s. which I took to immediately. It was a very, very colorful time. And it was almost like an old vanished New York that, I was very interested in kind of finding out about. And it was, the 1920s were the roaring 20s, of course. But on top of that, New York City, New York business, New York law community was all controlled by the Tammany Hall Democratic political machine. And so a lot of my research was into that, which Crater became a part of. It was also the golden age of Broadway. It was the fast nightlife, the changing sexual mores of the time. And then, of course, Prohibition was the law throughout that decade. So it was just a very kind of pivotal decade. So, and Crater, disappeared in 1930, the very end of the decade. And so historically speaking, it was the start of the Great Depression. It's kind of like a watershed period in the history of New York City. And then the other aspect that I got attracted to was the kind of whodunit of the what happened to him. Nobody really had any kind of credible explanation. There were all kinds of theories that he voluntarily disappeared for any number of reasons, that he fled. And then there were theories that he involuntarily disappeared for a number of reasons also. And so there really was no even kind of credible hypothesis of what happened to him. It was a total mystery. And so and I tried in writing the book to combine both things, hopefully successfully, but to give a real sense of his life and times in New York, and also to kind of structure it as a whodunit, that there are all these different theories, and so I kind of try to structure the book going back and forth in time to hold the reader's interest until the end.
When did you, Catherine actually mentioned that this has been a long-term labor of love for you. When did you actually start the book? Or the research for the book, I guess.
Yeah, in the acknowledgement of the book, I say that I started writing it when my son was born, and it took so long that he ended up editing the book. So it was quite a stretch. I wasn't writing during that whole time, although I am an inveterate rewriter of what I write. But the real issue is finding a publisher. I mean, I'm a first-time author. I got the proverbial 200 rejection letters, literally. And I applied to agents and to publishers. A lot of people said, why don't you just privately publish, which is, very popular now. But I thought, given that I wanted this to be a really comprehensive history of the case, I needed more gravitas from a publisher. And I ended up having the book published by an academic press, Syracuse University Press, and which was an experience in itself, because they had not really, they don't deal with many of the books of this type. And I remember, for example, I was speaking to the marketing person, and we were talking about on the hard copies of the books, on the back cover, there's at the top, there's a few words about the genre, and so they originally said New York State history biography. And I said, why don't we put in true crime? And they said, true crime? I don't think they even had a true crime book before. So they compromised, and it reads on the back, New York State history / true crime. Oh. But it turns out that a lot of the attention of the book so far has been from true crime podcasts. There's a whole industry now about, and unsolved historical mysteries, cold cases. I mean, it's on TV every day. And so I kind of just fortuitously ended up the book being published at a very opportune time.
Did you start your research early enough that you could talk to people that had personal memories of the case or Crater?
Yes, I not many, but the most memorable was I spoke to somebody who was very close, was a legal colleague of Crater's, and so knew him extremely well. His name was Simon Rifkind, and subsequent to Crater's disappearance, he had a very storied legal career. He became a federal judge, and he was one of the founders of the New York mega firm Paul Weiss Rifkind. Wharton and Garrison, I think, are the last two. So I wrote him a email, and he seemed interested. And I should say, from the very start, he was interviewed, since he was close to Crater. They worked in the same office, and Crater was sort of a mentor to Rifkind in teaching him how to write briefs and stuff. But in all his accounts of the case from day one, he said Crater couldn't have been the Crater he knew couldn't have been involved in anything shady or untoward. And he insisted that it must have been like a robbery, and he was an unintentional victim of some kind of. And so anyway, so part of the reason was he was getting on in years. I think he died the year after I spoke to him. So I thought maybe he wants to get some things off his chest, maybe knows more what happened to the good judge. And so I interviewed him at Paul Weiss in his corner office, and for about an hour, and he stuck to the same story, that Crater was the most upright man I've ever known. I cannot imagine. And actually, that kind of sort of got me thinking. And one of the remarkable things about Crater is he was born in Easton, Pennsylvania. He came to New York at age 20 in 1910 to enter Columbia Law School. He disappeared in 1930, so he spent only 20 years in New York. He knew nobody. His family was all in Pennsylvania, had no contacts. And in 20 years, he achieved remarkable success in very kind of disparate endeavors in the city. He first of all was a brilliant lawyer, a brilliant judge. He taught law school. He was a favorite teacher at NYU and Fordham Law School, and had stellar credentials, was very well respected by the judges in the courts he practiced. But at the same time, during the same period, he's working his way up Tammany Hall, which was a very corrupt political machine that dominated the city totally in all aspects of life. And he became friendly. He entered what was called the district club, which was a local club in the assembly district. And he entered one up in Harlem, which at that time was kind of a old German Jewish community up there. And he got to know very quickly the district leader of the club, who was a guy named Martin Healy. And Tammany Hall, it's interesting. What struck me is they stole millions easily from the city treasury and from other people. But even in Tammany Hall, there were two types of graft, both of which Tammany members participated in. So there was, it's an oxymoron, but honest graft was a commonly accepted term. And that involved, the perception at that time was honest graft was totally legal. But what it was using connections in the government to make money or using inside information that was held by the municipal government, which was controlled by Tammany. And it was taking advantage of inside information to buy up properties that were about to be condemned by the city at exorbitant prices. There was even kind of like bribery that to appear before an agency in the city, which were all controlled by Tammany, you had to hire a certain law firm that had connections to the agency, the heads of the agency. And basically you'd pay a huge amount to the law firm. They would take most of it and give the rest of it to the agency. And that somehow was not considered a conflict of interest. I mean, and then the second type was dishonest graft, which was money from brothels, from gambling dens, from drug trade. And so anyway, the club he got involved in, which was called the Cayuga Club, was involved in both and had its leader, district leader Healy, was really an old time kind of ward boss. If you look at pictures of him, he just looks, I think one of which was shown.
Was he the guy with the white
right,
hat?
Right, that's kind of glaring.
A real tough guy,
yeah. And he was just the epitome of an old time Irish ward boss. Yeah. And Crater became very, very friendly and connected to him.
Did the higher ups in Tammany approve equally of both types of graft, or were there some things that they found distasteful?
That's an interesting question. During most of Tammany's reign, which was over 75 years, from Boss Tweed to Boss Curry was the last one. Most of the bosses were involved in both types of graft. Mm-hmm. The exception was Charles Francis Murphy, who I mentioned before, who Professor Weiss had written a biography. He was the most, and also he's a significant character in the book, but he wanted to kind of legitimize Tammany Hall from just a grafting machine, which it had been under Boss Tweed, Boss Croker in the late 1890s. And so he came in around the turn of the century, and he allied himself with the progressive political movement. This was a period where in New York especially, was leading the country in child labor laws, all kinds of socioeconomic labor union recognition. And he smartly saw that this would get him a lot of votes.
Right.
And he allied himself with the progressive forces and basically brought up from the ranks two of the leading New York State progressive politicians, Al Smith and Robert Wagner. And so anyway, to answer your question, he kind of put a moratorium on dishonest graft, right, the real shady stuff, but continued with honest graft. And he made a lot of money too, but he just tried to improve the image of Tammany Hall.
Did the publicity and, just huge amount of attention that really attended this, the disappearance, did that have repercussions and bring greater attention to Tammany Hall? Did it help, declaw Tammany Hall a bit, or was it, were they separated?
No, they, right around the time of the disappearance was when the first signs of the attack on Tammany Hall, which ultimately succeeded in 1932 in overthrowing Jimmy Walker, who was the mayor and a Tammany loyalist. So Crater's disappearance occurred at really earlier that year was when Tammany scandals started to play out. So it was, his disappearance wasn't in a vacuum. And moreover, there was a significant breaking scandal days before he actually disappeared. A Tammany scandal involving judicial office spying.
Right.
And so that added to the just reaction to him disappearing, and ended up playing a big role in the re-election that fall of Governor Franklin Roosevelt. That Tammany corruption played a big role in that.
Another of the authors in our series, David McAllis, dealt with that in his biography of Eleanor, talked about the Franklin and conflicts with Tammany, et cetera. Yeah, so very interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit about the scandal that because that maybe one part of the mystery, or may not. It is a whodunit after all.
Mm-hmm.
But the scandals that were.
Yeah, I mean, the last known day of his life was he was very, very busy, but his actions were he seemed to take contradictory steps his last day. I mean, just briefly, in the morning, he's at his chambers cleaning out his office of records. He asks his clerk to cash a $5,500 check, which was big money at the time. He bundles up his papers from his chambers and brings them home with him with his clerk, and then dismisses his clerk. And then it doesn't come out till later, but uses those records to write up a private memo to his wife of people who owe him debts, lawyers who never paid, clients that never paid. So looking at that, you'd say he's obviously trying to flee. You know, he's closing out his chambers, he's leaving a private memo for his wife about who to go to collect money. But then he's next seen in Broadway, going to a ticket agency in Broadway and asking for a ticket for a show he had already seen a week before in Atlantic City, same show. And his ticket broker knew that because he had gone to Atlantic City with Crater the week before to see the show. So he asked for a ticket, that a ticket be held at this, at the theater. And then he strolls into a restaurant for dinner, in which he also was a regular patron. So, I mean, these aren't the actions that, you know, if he wanted to get out of the city and fast, you know, why show up in like the most crowded area of Manhattan, reserve a ticket, go to a restaurant where he'd be immediately recognized. And it turns out he ran into the two friends of his there. And then he gets into the taxi. So it's kind of schizophrenic, the way he's behaving that day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the reason why the mystery kind of caused a lot of confusion in people trying to solve the mystery. Because, you know, some of them just took his early actions that day as saying he was fleeing, whether with his mistress or for political reasons or whatever. And then, you know, the other theories are that he was basically bumped off for a number of reasons. Blackmail by a mistress or a chorus girlfriend, for political scandal and whatnot. So I don't want to give too much of the whodunit away, but in the explanation I give, hypothesis, I guess, of what happened to him, I think really both elements were at play. That he wanted to flee and was in the process of fleeing, and then there was an intervention that prevented him. So anyway, I think that kind of, and the other thing that caused so much difficulty in the investigation is the family, his wife only learned about it, really learned that he was really possibly missing maybe in the middle of August. And she came down and talked to his friends and lawyers, and they all said, he's going to be back. He's out on a bender, which was very possible with Crater. And so anyway, they hushed it up until September 3rd. So you had almost a month in between his last sighting and when it became public, when the police got on it.
So one other action that I remember reading in the book, I mean, he was supposed to actually stay in Maine with his wife. You mentioned that she came down from Maine. He was supposed to stay up there longer and came down to New York all of a sudden, correct?
Right. He was up at their summer cabin in Belgrade Lakes with his wife, and he had actually just come up from the city the night before. and he places a call at an outside. They didn't have any phone in their cabin back then. And he places the next night a call. He's all alone. Nobody knew who he was calling. The police surprisingly didn't. I think there were ways to check phone numbers back then. Never did so. And after getting off the phone, he met his wife and said, I got to go back to the city tomorrow to straighten some guys out. That's what his wife reported. So yeah, so he goes back, and then he was supposed to come back on a few days later to Stella, because it was his wife's birthday, and he promised her he would be up there. And so something happened in between,
right,
from the time he came down. And the other thing I think which brought some new light into the whole mystery was I got access through a Freedom of Information Law request to the NYPD police files. And they were invaluable because the reporting at the time in newspapers was shoddy, and people, and it may have been that some of the people they interviewed didn't want to say, you know. Right. So they would say things in newspaper articles, people were quoted. And then I would look at the police records, which had the day-to-day investigation, and it's the police department's witnesses with these same people, and they say the diametrically opposite things.
Wow. But did the police in it? You mentioned they didn't check phone numbers. Did the police do a good job of investigating this at the time, or in the years that they kept the investigation open?
Well, it's the police department, which I also address in the book, was kind of out of stage. It used to be just a grafting arm of Tammany Hall, and it was now starting to come into its own as an independent law enforcement agency. And the commissioner of the police commissioner for the first time was somebody that had been promoted from the ranks and was honest, not connected with Tammany Hall. So there were a lot of things that I think the police did not, at that point, did not intentionally botch the investigation. From what I can tell from the files, they talked to the right people. Where the cover-up came was there was a grand jury that was seated, very odd grand jury, because usually grand jury is focused on charging criminal charges against a target or a suspect or what. So they impaneled a grand jury to find out what happened to Judge Crater. And that grand jury was run by the Manhattan district attorney, who was a Tammany loyalist. And he was in charge of presenting the evidence and the police officers to the grand jury. So I think there was some shenanigans with that. And the conclusion of the grand jury was, we have no idea what happened to this guy. Absolutely, we're not even going to suggest a possibility. So I think on that level, there was some interference. But ironically, as again, not giving away too much at the end, but the best clue, the best chance for solving the mystery came in 1955. And it was a tip to the police. And that's where the police files were also invaluable. the police, it's clear from pursued the investigation and then they discounted the evidence because of, and this again was not because of intentional malfeasance, but they got the people who were associated with Crater, who were involved in this evidence, mixed up. Oh. And so totally inadvertently, like more from the fact that, you know, police 25 years later did not have the same knowledge, you know, of the period and who Crater was, his cronies were. And so ultimately, ironically, I think the police department blew their last good chance to crack the case because of just not knowing the history, you know, so.
And that, I assume the psychic that got involved was not overly helpful.
Yes, that was in connection with this clue in 1955. This was another just absurd turn in the Crater investigation. So it turns out that the witness who told the police came in and confided to the police about something that happened up in the Westchester house. That contemporaneously with that, but with no knowledge of the police development, a journalist went to the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands to consult a psychic, basically, a clairvoyant, I guess is the term they used, who had, you know, it was a young guy, but he had been very successful in solving all these cases, mysteries, missing items, seemingly psychically. Mm-hmm. And he was at the university and he had a panel of scientists who were trying to figure out what the hell. So anyway, how he was doing this. So anyway, so the journalist brought a picture of Crater, who, you know, he didn't say he was coming, didn't say anything about, laid it down on the table face down of the clairvoyant. And the clairvoyant kind of went into this little seance thing and ended up drawing a map showing where Crater was killed. I mean, just I don't even, he must have known, I guess, New York City's, but he drew the Manhattan, the Bronx, and he said the judge was taken from here and marked right where the Broadway, where he caught the cab would have been, and then said he was killed at a house up here. And I mean, there's certain thing, you know, you could say he could have researched famous missing person case, and you know, he said it was a judge and he disappeared at, you know, this time. But there were certain things about where Crater was, he said, was killed and how he was killed that were directly coincided with what the witness told the police. So I mean, it's just too bizarre. And then the police department again blows it because they just don't know the history of Crater. And you know,
it's great that this does have all the elements of true crime, including the a clairvoyant who's you know, you see that on a lot of television. Do you think this is ever going to be solved once and for all, other than, or if your hypothesis is will you ever be able to prove your hypothesis correct or incorrect, or any other theory about what happened?
Well, probably not, but I think there is, in connection with this location up in Westchester, the house still exists. Back then, it was in a very country area, so there've been houses built, in what was the backyard, but they've never really made a real search of the backyard of this house. And I don't know.
Yeah.
There may be a very faint chance that, especially with the technology these days, that they can, they don't have to dig up the whole backyard.
Right.
They have these sonar or scanning, or, I don't know, but it's a very small possibility, but you never know.
So now that you've, I mean, I do want to mention that the book has gotten some pretty favorable reviews. I mean, that you were mentioned 3 times in the Wall Street Journal this summer. You were mentioned, the book was reviewed. It was mentioned as one of the top reviews of the prior month.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Oh, yeah. And then
that.
it also got a mention as one of the, a great true crime. There was a list of 10 or 11 books that they said would be great true crime reads, and it gets a mention.
I didn't know.
They all point you back to the same review, but it was nice to be mentioned 3 times. So
yeah,
great. It's great to have the recognition. I assume that's gratifying for you. Have you given any thought to continuing to write? Is there anything in the future for you here?
Let me before I'm going to write, but at this point I have writer's block about what my next book is. It's going to be something legally based, involving the law, involving history. But I haven't decided. Right. Yeah. No, I don't think it'll be another missing person's case. But what I was going to just add to the answer, I did get a very nice review in the Wall Street Journal, but where my book was mainly picked up, interestingly, is, these online podcasts,
Right.
these YouTube videos. And that's what I was saying before. I was kind of lucky at my timing. I mean, this over the internet, the number of sites about missing persons, cold cases, just all over the place. Just to give you one example, I don't think I mentioned to you before, but last summer, before my book came out, BuzzFeed did a video, part of a series of unsolved, mysteries and cold cases. And they did one on the Crater case before my case came out. And, it was a half hour, and there were the 2 hosts who are like online celebrities. But yeah, I just looked at it before coming on here. 3.5 million people viewed this thing about the Crater case. Now, if 2% of those had go out and bought my book, but it seems, there's the book world is getting separated from the online, the internet. It's kind of very interesting. And I was recently contacted by I can't say the name, but on a major history series channel that want to do a book. So, I mean, that just the true crime aspect of it, which was played up in the Wall Street Journal, is, I think, how I really have to get the book better marketed and But it just, for me, it was interesting, just the whole process of, and it's interfacing, publishing's interfacing with, the internet, TV, film industry. So anyway, we'll see.
Great. I think we're going to shift to Q&A in a minute, but I did have one question that I didn't get a chance to ask you, which is just the process of writing. I mean, you clearly had a what is undoubtedly a very demanding day job. Did you write in spurts? Did you set aside a little time every day? How did you approach the writing of the book and the research, quite frankly?
Yeah. Most of both were done on the weekends. I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library on 42nd Street, and going through old newspapers, old records. So that was pretty much all on weekends, and most of the writing was too. I mean, I had a hard time, at the end of the day, sitting down. But what struck me, I mean, we both wrote senior theses, and back at the time, it was like, oh my God, what a massive effort. But just writing a whole book, especially a nonfiction where you have to notate everything, source everything, and the editing of that, in my law practice, a 40-page brief is about as long as you get. Yeah. And it was just kind of mind-boggling to me, writing, trying to maintain readability and writing, such a large thing. Yeah. But I got through it, and now I know hopefully my second book will come a little easier to publication.
I'll just add that you not only got through it, but you got through it. It was a very readable book. I mean, it was really a pleasure. It was a pleasure to read, and
oh, thank you.
Just a lot of fun. So I think we're probably ready for questions.
And here we are. I agree with Bruce's assessment. This was a really fun book to read. I just, as a almost lifelong New York City resident now, found it just really, really interesting to go back in time. Couple of interesting comments from some of our classmates. David Keller notes that Heinlein made a reference to Judge Crater in Stranger in a Strange Land. Peggy Russell, prior to your saying anything about it, Bruce, wrote in that she first heard about Judge Crater on the Dick Van Dyke Show. And in response to a question, she revealed that she also went and said, "Hey, Dad, what is this?"
Yeah, oh, very good.
So, I recall during childhood, there were two local figures that my mother talked about all the time: Judge Crater and the Collier Brothers. and the Collier Brothers, by the way, was the topic of a fantastic book by E.L. Doctorow called I think Homer and Langley. But that leads me to asking you, Steve, what do you like to read when you're not reading cases?
A mixture. I'm really mainly history, biography. But I like novels too. I can't remember but usually, American history in particular is really what I enjoy. Yeah, and I do a lot of reading in my job, and so that kind of takes something out of it, and it's a very different style writing, obviously. You're a lawyer also, as I understand, and very different style of writing. And it was funny because the Wall Street Journal review said, as you know, he writes well for a lawyer, which was kind of a backhanded slap, but but in what was overall a good review.
Well, and that tails into some other comments from some of our listeners. David Keller also wants to note that one Amazon reviewer gave you 5 stars and said it would make a great movie. Is it happening? And who do you see as playing Judge Crater?
That's a question I get. When I was writing it, and I had some friends in the television, film, movie industry, they all, they read parts of it or heard it, and they thought it would make a great movie. And obviously some of the reviews on, I think obviously because of the colorful times, backdrop to the story of, Manhattan in the Roaring 20s. And so I haven't, like I said, I have a contact from a TV series, Unsolved Cases series. And if it gets to a movie, I just don't want to write the screenplay because I don't know how it, given you're talking about the key evidence coming out 25 years after he disappeared, I don't know, just writing, that would be difficult for me. But if somebody wants to do it, as to who would play it, that's difficult because he was a weird looking character. If you notice from the pictures, the book, and somebody asked me that, and I said, well, maybe they could computer generate a figure in the movie, that because he was a very unusual looking man. He had this long, scrawny neck and big shoulders and small head, and I don't know. If they picked an actor, they'd have to do a lot of makeup or changing of his body features to. But anyway, if somebody wants to make a movie, I'd be thrilled.
Well, I was laughing about as you were saying you didn't want to do the screenplay because I think we have a classmate who writes a lot of legal-based screenplays.
Oh, I know.
So
maybe he's watching.
Picking up on picking up on your expressed love of reading historical things, Peggy Russell notes that she thinks you were law school classmates and didn't know it, for one thing.
Yes.
And also thanks you for the talk, and says that and you may know this, with regard to the famous New York law firm of Paul Weiss Morris Rifkin, we had a classmate, Adam Bello, who started with 79 but graduated with 80, who co-edited a big historical project about Simon Rifkin. Peggy remembers when he was working on it.
Wow. What was the name again?
Adam Bello.
Bello. That I didn't hear of. Hi, Peggy. I do remember Peggy from law school. That's interesting because I know there a whole Simon Rifkin trust has been set up, and I guess this was probably part of it. But I'd definitely be interested in pursuing that.
Oh, and now we've got nominations.
For people.
So Hank Lubin has also said it's no surprise that his pal from the 6th century of Pine has become such a scholar, and he's ordered the book. Okay. And also has nominated David Kelly to write or produce it. And then from Angel Garcia, we have a nomination David Streithorn for Judge Crater in the movie, and I may be mispronouncing that. I don't know if either of you know the correct pronunciation.
Yeah, I can't picture him, but I'll look it up.
You'll have to go back and look.
Can I ask one other question, which
Sure.
is, you just mentioned Rifkind again, and do you think it was a failure of memory, an imperfect memory, or do you think he was trying to protect the reputation or resurrect the reputation of an old friend?
I came to kind of a different take on it, that it wasn't a memory issue, but that he really did believe that Crater couldn't have been involved in any of these shady deals. And see, I think, and what I try to point out in the book, Crater, he was involved in this, in the Broadway scene, the nightclubs, the chorus line. He was involved in dirty Tammany Hall politics, and he was a great lawyer and judge. And I think he was able to compartmentalize his life depending on who he was dealing with. So, and I kind of suggest that in the book, that in other words, Rifkin just knew Crater as they worked in the same law firm, as a legal colleague. And he didn't know anything about his personal life, certainly, or probably anything about his Tammany connections. And, Rifkin obviously was unaffiliated with Tammany Hall. But his boss, Robert Wagner, who became very prominent senator from New York and was involved in the New Deal labor legislation, the Wagner Act. And so he was brought up in Tammany. He kind of rose through the ranks, but he was totally honest, as far as I can tell, as was Al Smith, and was part of Boss Murphy's attempt to legitimize Tammany Hall by allying them with these progressive political forces. So that's my take, that he was. The other thing that struck me, a judge would never do this today, but Crater apparently hung out very prominently in nightclubs, risque kind of nightclubs. And for whatever reason, he must have been seen, people must have known who he was, but I guess maybe there just wasn't the kind of coverage or there was more of kind of like, let this be that, he's a prominent judge. We don't want to embarrass him. We like that he's hanging out, in the fast nightlife of the city. And so there may have been some of that, that they just, like I said, a judge would never, today show up in any kind of risque situation, and I think it was part of the 20s. The 20s were a fascinating period where the morality, the mores were changed very quickly. It was a really wild time. And that's what kind of attracted me a good deal to this case. But I think, so in other words, there was less of the kind of like gotcha, you're in a place you're not supposed to be, you're part of a world that you're not supposed to be, and we're going to spread this around and embarrass you. It was more like live and let live, have fun. That was the big spirit, just enjoy yourself. And, don't be so worried about other people, what they're doing. So I kind of came out with it, that was kind of part of the zeitgeist of the 20s in New York, sort of. Or
Well,
it could
you
have
know,
been covered.
it's really interesting because I mean, it sounds like he was quite the chameleon.
Right.
And if you were Simon Rifkind and didn't hang around in those circles and there was no New York Post page 6, you might not
Right.
know about the double life.
Exactly. And chameleon is a good word. I think of Woody Allen's movie Zelig from way back, where he's showing up in all these different disparate, I don't know if you saw it.
Oh yeah.
He shows up like with Hitler, and with, he's kind of just latches on to whatever. Yeah, so a chameleon, or whether life was, I guess, more compartmentalized, like I was saying, I think that has a lot to do with it. Why he was free to pursue all these, to pursue the, although the chorus girls, that even then was a little off key, and it was played up in the tabloids, certainly, when he disappeared. But that would not have been reason for taking away his judgeship, for example, where it might be today. So the morals, just the morals, and just it goes into how business was run in the city back then. It was, you didn't have any regulation. You didn't have Securities Act of, prohibiting use of inside information, to make it rich. It was it was like an open town, and businesses did what they pleased. They paid off, when they needed. I mean, there were some, in the book, there were some examples that famous architects like Frederick French, who I believe was the architect of Tudor City on the East 40s. He had to make a payoff to Tammany in order to build that. It was just the accepted way. It was graft, honest graft, hopefully. But there just were no laws or ethical considerations that business took into account.
And that's a great segue into a question Dana Hofstetter posed, which is, what do you think were the things that really changed that political climate in New York City?
The Great Depression, in a word. And he, Crater, disappeared, a year after the market crash, in October or November 29. And that just kind of revolutionized New York City. It, first of all, took away from Tammany the carrots that they used. Tammany kind of functioned as a local social organization. When those fires, they would send clothes to their, the people who were living in their district. They would send turkeys at Christmas. They were kind of local, not charities, but they really had important parts in their constituents' lives, and also in terms of getting jobs. I mean, before, during the 20s, the Tammany people had a lot of power to get people jobs in the government and outside government through their pull. And then the crash came, and the economic crisis, and the New Deal came, which was on the federal level, but that was the start of the big socioeconomic legislation like Social Security, Medicare, all the kind of safety nets. And in New York, Mayor LaGuardia he took over, which was also a crucial thing. He was elected in 1934, and he was obviously hostile to Tammany. And so he shut Tammany out of the local government. At the same time, he was getting huge amounts of infrastructure funds and jobs through the New Deal programs. There was a real alliance between LaGuardia and Roosevelt. There have been books that have been written about that. And so the state kind of replaced Tammany in a lot of what that kept them going. That was kind of the fuel for their machine. In turn, also civil service. Once LaGuardia came in, he tightened the civil service. It used to be almost any government job would be dispensed by Tammany, irrespective of what the qualifications for the job or the qualifications of the person. So, civil service reforms. But it all had to do with the oncoming financial crisis because of an economic crisis that was hurting people during the Depression. And lastly, I quote somebody in the book, but the point was basically in the 20s, it was kind of almost entertaining to have, Jimmy Walker as mayor, who's night clubbing, and the whole Tammany group that, everyone was trying to make it rich. And the economic times in the 20s were better. And so, there was, I think, tendency maybe to laugh at or excuse all the pilfering that was being done of the government's money. It's kind of like entertaining, that you had these kind of celebrity, like Walker was really the first celebrity politician, I think. And then, in the 1930s, it's not so funny. If you don't have money to eat, and, then Tammany, regrafting all the money from the people's money, essentially, from the government, doesn't seem so funny. So yeah, that was the big change, the financial crisis of the Great.
Thanks for that. And Dana, great question. Thank you. One thing that you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on is that your son edited the book for you, which was, given the amount of research, as you noted before, and the amount of facts that needed to be synthesized, probably also a gargantuan effort. We
Sure.
had a while ago, Rob Goldberg was one of our authors on a program, and he talked about a book that was a family effort. What was it like having your son edit your work of 30 years?
It was, I found it great. It happened to coincide with the onset of the pandemic. So he was, working from home, and work was slow, but he was great. I mean, he didn't check the sources, but he just did a read through, page by page, line by line, and had great suggestions. And I thought it was great. I really, like I was saying, it was such an immense task to me. I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. And I think the Syracuse University Press, there's less editorial oversight, obviously, than at a major publishing house. So I didn't get it from them, like an editor saying, why don't you change these two chapters and rearrange this story? So I really appreciated, all the help I could get from him. And he didn't go to Princeton, but he went to Cornell. That is involved in computers somehow, which I don't understand any of.
Well, I thought he did a really good job for what it's worth. And you mentioned, you mentioned the Syracuse University Press. If I remember correctly, this was part of a series that they did on New York history. How did your book come to their attention? Or how did they come to your attention?
That was the connection. They're known for, like you say, a series on New York State history. And I think that, but I had sent to other academic presses in the area, Columbia, NYU, and I don't understand the whole process of why they take books or not, but they never thought that it would be as big. I never thought it would be as big as it's been. I've been very pleasantly surprised. And there were just a few interactions with the press that I won't go into them, but they just didn't handle books like this. You're not talking about movie and TV serialization for the average book published by Syracuse University Press, but they actually got lucky. And I think last year or the year before, they published, I forget the name of the book, but it was by the son of a Holocaust survivor who was a boxer at the concentration camps. And that was how he kind of made it through. They used to have these matches, and if you lost, that was the end of you. And Barry Levinson made a Netflix movie out of it, which I haven't seen. I think it's called The Survivor. But there again, this was a memoir, a son writing about his father's experience, and so they did pretty well with that, I imagine, the press. But I did miss the editorial help, which was why I drew my son in. So.
Can I'll ask an editing question, if I might, which is just, so the book wound up about 275 pages. How long was it before you started editing it, would you guess?
I took I must have cut about a third of it. And funny story with my son's editing of it, we were always joking about the Libby Hotel chapter, which I got interested in, began and thought that it was part of the story, as honest graft. And it was interesting because it was a Jewish luxury hotel on the Lower East Side. And so that, what is now a chapter 4 or 5, was 2 chapters. And my son, and also as a lawyer, the way I found out about that, which nobody had done, is I went to the actual court records, the appellate record, and sat down and for days and days and read through the different motions. And I, as a lawyer, was kind of personally fascinated by it and the judicial ethics of the time, which were very different. So I had written the Libby Hotel episode into 2 pages. And every time I talked to him, he'd be, oh, the Libby Hotel. That was like his nemesis. So, and partly because of that, I cut it down probably in half. And I think he was right. I just got too involved in the law and the, legal angle. But,
It is a pretty fascinating part of the book, and it's a scandal that's close to, very close to Crater, obviously. So it's
yeah. And it's usually, although it's usually tossed about as the first or second explanation for his disappearance.
Yeah.
So I also, just to discount that, I felt I had to really, I thought it was fascinating with the real estate company in the 20s and what they were doing. And so anyway, that was cut a good deal.
Great. Well, Steve, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and for providing such a good read. Bruce, thank you for moderating. All of you, thank you for joining, and a special thanks to a number of folks who have dialed in from the West Coast early this morning. Stay tuned, watch Facebook and your emails to hear what we have planned for the rest of the academic year in terms of more in this series featuring our artists and authors. And again, thanks everybody. We will see you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Bruce. And
Our
Kathy.
pleasure.
And
thank you so
thank
much.
you for everyone listening. And if you like the book, you can always use a few Amazon reviews or ratings, just the star ratings. But thank you. It was very good.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.